The Spanish Armada wasn't just a fleet, it was the superpower of its age, and its mission was to crush England forever. Welcome back everyone to Hidden History Stories. In today's episode, we're uncovering how a desperate gamble with 8 blazing fire ships in 1588 shattered Spain's so-called Invincible Armada, saving England from invasion and changing the balance of power on the seas for centuries to come. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and share it with anyone who loves exploring the past. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now, let's begin. Picture this. It's just after midnight on July 9th, 1588. You're a Spanish sailor anchored off the coast of Calais, and suddenly, through the darkness, you see 8 ships bearing down on you. They're completely engulfed in flames, moving fast with the wind and tide, and they're headed straight for your fleet. This is the moment that changed everything. Let me take you back a few months. Spain in 1588 wasn't just powerful, it was the superpower. King Philip II controlled an empire that stretched from the Philippines to Peru. Spanish silver from American mines funded the most feared army in Europe. The Spanish tercios had never lost a major battle. Never. And Philip had decided it was time to invade England. He'd spent 2 years building the largest invasion fleet ever assembled, 130 ships, 30,000 men. 8 million ducats, that's enough gold to run his entire government for 2 years. The Spanish called it the Empresa de Inglaterra, the enterprise of England. England, by comparison, was nobody. Queen Elizabeth ruled maybe 4 million subjects. Her treasury was constantly broke. She had 34 royal ships, plus whatever armed merchants she could scrape together. By every measure, Spain should have crushed England like an insect. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Spain's greatest naval commander, Don Alvaro de Bazan, had planned the whole invasion. But 4 months before the fleet sailed, Bazan died suddenly. Philip needed a replacement fast. He chose the Duke of Medina Sidonia. The Duke's response? He literally begged Philip not to give him the job. He wrote a desperate letter explaining that he'd never commanded a fleet before. He got seasick. He had no experience in naval warfare. Please, he pleaded, choose someone else. Philip ignored him. So Medina Sidonia accepted his fate with aristocratic dignity. He'd do his duty even though he was convinced it would end in disaster. Turns out, he was right. When the Armada finally left Lisbon on May 30th, 1588, it was a sight that had never been seen before. The fleet stretched 7 miles across the ocean. Massive galleons displaced over 1,000 tons each. Supply ships carried 124,000 cannonballs, 5,000 arquebuses, 11,000 barrels of wine, and mountains of hardtack biscuits. But within 2 weeks, Atlantic storms scattered the fleet like toys. Ships limped into La Coruña for repairs. Critical supplies spoiled in the damaged holds. They didn't sail again until July 12th, 6 weeks behind schedule. And by then, the English knew they were coming. Elizabeth's spymaster, Francis Walsingham, had been tracking Philip's every move through his network of agents across Europe. England mobilized every ship they had. The Lord High Admiral Charles Howard gathered his fleet at Plymouth. Under him sailed some of the most dangerous sea captains alive: Francis Drake, John Hawkins, Martin Frobisher. These men had spent decades raiding Spanish ships. They knew how the Spanish fought, and they had a plan. The English ships were different from Spanish galleons. Spanish ships were high-castled floating fortresses designed for boarding and hand-to-hand combat. English ships sat lower in the water, mounted heavier long-range guns, and could sail circles around the Spanish. The strategy was simple: hit them hard from a distance, never let them get close. On July 19th, 1588, a small ship raced into Plymouth with urgent news. The Armada had been spotted off Cornwall. According to legend, Drake was playing bowls when the message arrived. He supposedly insisted on finishing his game first, saying there was time enough to beat the Spaniards after. Whether that actually happened, we'll never know. But the English did wait for the tide before sailing out that evening. Meanwhile, out on the open water, the two fleets first clashed on July 21st off Plymouth. The Spanish held a tight crescent formation, their strongest galleons on the wings, protecting the vulnerable supply ships in the center. Medina Sidonia had strict orders from Philip. Don't get drawn into a fight with the English fleet. Just sail to the rendezvous point and pick up the invasion army. But the English had other ideas. Howard's ships darted forward, unleashed devastating broadsides at extreme range, then tacked away before the Spanish could close the distance. The Spanish guns, mostly short-range cannons designed to clear enemy decks before boarding, couldn't reach the English ships. This went on for a week. Every day brought new skirmishes as the English harried the Spanish up the English Channel. The Spanish maintained their formation with iron discipline, but they were getting hammered. Two Spanish ships were already lost. The Rosario collided with another vessel and lost her foremast. The San Salvador's powder magazine exploded, killing 200 men instantly. Both ships were captured by the English. And here's what really terrified Medina Sidonia. They were running out of ammunition fast. By July 27th, the Armada dropped anchor off Calais, just 25 miles from where the invasion army waited. The English anchored nearby, watching. The two fleets sat within cannon shot of each other, separated by less than a mile of dark water. But what happened next would change naval warfare forever. That night, English commanders gathered aboard Howard's flagship for a council of war. They'd hurt the Spanish fleet, sure, but they hadn't broken it. That crescent formation was still holding. Spanish discipline was still rock solid. And now the Spanish were about to link up with the Duke of Parma's army, 27,000 battle-hardened soldiers waiting with invasion barges. If that happened, England was finished. Drake proposed something desperate: fire ships. Fire ships were the nightmare weapon of Renaissance naval warfare. You'd take old vessels, pack them with anything flammable, set them ablaze, and sail them into enemy fleets. They rarely sank ships, but the terror they caused could shatter even the most disciplined formation. The Spanish knew about fire ships. Medina Sidonia had posted patrol boats specifically to intercept them. He'd ordered captains to have boats ready to tow away any burning vessels. The Spanish were prepared, or so they thought. Just after midnight on July 29th, Spanish lookouts saw them coming. 8 shapes emerging from the darkness, moving with the wind and tide. Every single one ablaze from bow to stern, flames roaring into the night sky. These weren't ordinary fire ships. The English had loaded them with pitch, tar, and anything else that would burn hot and fast. Their guns were loaded so they'd discharge from the heat, random cannon fire exploding from burning hulks. Spanish patrol boats rowed out to intercept them, but the fire ships were moving too fast. Sailors tried to grapple them away, but the heat was too intense. You couldn't get near them. The burning vessels crashed into the outer edge of the Spanish formation, and that's when everything fell apart. Picture the scene. It's pitch black except for these 8 infernos bearing down on you. Random cannons are firing from the flames. The wind is pushing them straight at your ship, and you're anchored, unable to maneuver. Panic erupted. Captains screamed orders. Sailors hacked at anchor cables with axes rather than waste time hauling them up. That beautiful crescent formation, the one they'd held perfectly for a week, dissolved in minutes as ships scattered in every direction. Medina Sidonia's galleass, the San Lorenzo, collided with another vessel in the chaos and lost her rudder. She drifted helplessly toward the French coast. By dawn, the Spanish fleet was scattered across miles of ocean, and the English were coming. At daybreak on July 29th, Howard's fleet attacked with everything they had. The Spanish no longer had their protective formation. They were isolated, vulnerable, and about to pay for it. English captains closed to within 100 yards point-blank range by the standards of the day and pounded the Spanish galleons with devastating broadsides. The battle raged for 9 hours straight. The Maria Juan, carrying 275 men, took so many shots below the waterline that she simply sank, taking all but one crewman down with her. The San Mateo and San Felipe were so badly damaged they had to be run aground. Medina Sidonia's flagship, the San Martin, took over 200 cannonball hits. English gunners were firing faster than the Spanish had thought possible. They used four-wheeled gun carriages that allowed rapid reloading, while Spanish guns were mounted on two-wheeled carriages that had to be manually hauled back after each shot. By late afternoon, the Spanish fleet was in full retreat, sailing northeast with the wind. They'd lost formation, lost ships, expended nearly all their ammunition, and suffered thousands of casualties. Medina Sidonia sent another desperate message to the Duke of Parma, begging for help. No help came. Parma's invasion barges were trapped in harbour by Dutch rebel ships. The invasion was over, but the nightmare was just beginning. Here's the thing about the prevailing winds in the English Channel: they blow from the southwest. That means the Spanish fleet was being pushed into the North Sea, away from home. Medina Sidonia faced an impossible choice. He couldn't sail back through the Channel. The English fleet blocked that route, and the Spanish had no ammunition left for another fight. The only escape was to sail north around Scotland, then west around Ireland, then finally south to Spain. That's over 2,000 miles through some of the most dangerous waters in the world. The battered fleet sailed north. Supplies ran desperately short. Water barrels had been contaminated by seawater during the battle. Disease spread like wildfire. Men died of thirst, dysentery, and typhus. Ships leaked from battle damage. Pumps worked day and night just to keep vessels afloat. Then September came, and with it, the storms. The equinoctial gales hit like hammering fists from hell. These were Atlantic hurricanes, roaring out of the Western Ocean with savage fury. Ships already damaged in battle simply came apart in the mountainous seas. The Santa Maria de la Rosa struck rocks off Ireland and sank within minutes, drowning all but one of her 400 men. The Girona wrecked on the coast of Northern Ireland, killing 1,300 men. The Gran Grin, the Rata Encoronada, the Lavia, one by one, the great ships of Spain were smashed to pieces on rocky coasts. Some survivors managed to stagger ashore. Most were killed by English soldiers or Irish chieftains looking for plunder. A few were sheltered by sympathetic locals and eventually ransomed. Most simply vanished into the dark waters, their bones scattered across the northern seas. In late September and October, what was left of the Armada limped back to Spanish ports. Of the 130 ships that had sailed in May, only 67 returned. Over 15,000 men were dead, most from starvation, disease, and drowning rather than English cannons. The ships that did make it back were barely floating wrecks. Medina Sidonia, ravaged by illness and grief, retired to his estates. He never commanded at sea again. When Philip received the news, he reportedly said, "I sent my ships to fight against men, not against the winds and waves of God." Spain would try again. They launched other armadas in 1596 and 1597, but none would succeed in invading England. The failure didn't immediately end Spanish power. Spain remained the dominant European empire for decades, but the psychological impact was enormous. Spain's invincibility, that aura that had terrified Europe, was shattered. England had survived. And now they'd grow bolder, sending expeditions to challenge Spanish monopolies around the world. The age of Spanish dominance on the seas was ending. The age of English naval power was just beginning. Within a generation, English ships would be sailing to Virginia, establishing colonies on the Atlantic coast. They'd challenge Dutch merchants for control of the spice trade. They'd found the East India Company and begin carving out an empire that would eventually span the globe. None of that would have been possible if the Armada had succeeded. If those 8 fire ships hadn't scattered the Spanish formation that midnight in July. If the English captains hadn't pressed their attack at Gravelines with such ferocity. The Spanish sailors who drowned in the cold waters off Ireland and Scotland, they didn't know they were witnessing the end of an era. The English gunners who loaded and fired until their hands bled, they couldn't have imagined their great-grandchildren would rule the waves. But history turns on moments like these. On desperate gambles that somehow work. On burning ships sailed into the darkness by men who knew they might not return. And it all pivoted on 8 flaming hulks sent into the night on a summer tide in 1588 that shattered not just a fleet, but the myth of Spanish invincibility itself. That's courage. That's desperation. That's how empires fall and new ones rise. That's history. That was the end of the story of the Spanish Armada, the so-called Invincible Fleet that was broken by fire, storm, and desperation. If you found this story fascinating, remember to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss more hidden history stories. And let me know in the comments, what is your favorite historical era?